This is Closereads,
a philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. Hey there, we're going to talk about some parts of Aristotle's Metaphysics. So specifically, we wanted to engage hopefully a few different places in the text where he is responding specifically to Plato's theory of forms, which notoriously is not actually described very well or with consistency in Plato's dialogues. Apparently, the Platonic school that Aristotle was aware of attended, right?
Yeah, no, he was there for a long time with Plato, studying under Plato, and only he wrote the Metaphysics, I think, shortly after leaving in his late 30s. So
we might get a much clearer idea of what his theory of forms is from Aristotle's presentation of it and objections to it. And the first place we found in the text that was we covered in very cursory manner in our latest Partially Examined Life episode, the first in that series on Plato's Metaphysics. But you don't have to have listened to that to start with us here. We're going to read Book 1, aka Book Big Alpha, Chapter 9.
Yeah, you don't have to listen to that because you're not going to understand it anyway. Neither are we. No, it's a tough chapter. It's not his. It's not the place where he's. So sorry. The bulk of his critique of Plato's forms does not occur here. It occurs at the end of the book. What we get here is a kind of appetizer introduction to the critique, and his account of the forms is going to sound really weird because he's treating Plato as a Pythagorean, and for instance will claim that the forms are numbers. So there's obviously a lot of stuff going on in the school and conversations going on between him and Plato, which we are not privy to in the dialogues and the work that we have available from Plato.
And we're reading the Joe Sachs translation. It's page 21 of the actual book. I will link to a PDF of just this section so that folks can follow along. Would you like to start us off, Wes?
Sure. As far as the Pythagoreans are concerned, then, let the things now said be left alone, for it is enough to touch on them this much. But as for those who set up the forms, first of all, in seeking to understand the causes of the things around us, they brought in other things equal to these in number, as though someone who wanted to count a smaller number of things thought he couldn't do it, but could count them if he made them more. So this is the only joke that I know that Aristotle makes.
Okay.
This little ironic jab. So here we already have a first critique, which is that you're expanding your ontology by introducing the forms. You have not only the perceptible things in the world as entities, but now you have this new world of entities that are at least as many, he says, equal to these in number as the things themselves, which sounds a bit weird because we normally are thinking of forms as universals.
Right. So they're certainly not equal to the types. I mean, of the tokens, the individuals. If you've got a million rabbits, it's supposed to actually help you to say there's a form of rabbithood, and this helps explain the rabbits. We don't actually care when we're trying to understand rabbithood, the idiosyncrasies of all the particular rabbits. We're just trying to get at rabbithood.
Yeah. And the forms, they broadly agree on the necessity of explaining the essence of particular objects, of that there's a formal answer for what it is to be a particular thing, and that involves an appeal to a kind. It's just a matter of locating the essence in a sense. And I think when so it's a little bit confusing that he's saying that they're equal in number, but I think part of the problem is that the forms, kind of like rabbits, are promiscuous and multiply indefinitely, and they do that because as Aristotle will accuse him of later on in the book, that you need forms of the forms. So he'll call this the third man argument later on. But basically, the form of the essence. Okay, so the essence of rabbit is the form rabbit, but the essence of the form um, rabbit
Formhood.
must be rabbit prime,
Hmm.
and so on. That's the accusation he's going to make, and I think also um, you need all these forms of the form. So the idea is that there's just going to be this infinite regress of forms. It's a argument we're familiar with in philosophy, and that he himself will call the third man argument.
Well, is this the same issue as you refer to? There are going to be forms, essences of individuals, and so I can look at an individual rabbit and say, "What is your essence? Is it rabbithood?" But you could also, any genus that holds that particular individual in it, you could say maybe there's a form of that. So there's a form of rabbithood, but is there a form of animality in general, of just being an animal? Is there a form of whiteness that the rabbit has? Right. Is it, so does this individual saying there's an essence to that individual? I mean, we did cover this in the Aristotle's categories episode, that where, the individual is the substance, right? Or it's, I think if I'm remembering correctly, there was sort of an ambiguity between the individual that is the substance and its most important genus that is the more important, that we also call substance. Is that correct?
So yeah, right. So there's Aristotle has primary substance and secondary substance.
There we go.
Primary substance is just the individual particular thing, like a rabbit.
Mm-hmm.
And he believes, unlike Plato, he believes individual particular sensible things have essences. Plato doesn't think that's possible because it's in the realm of becoming and flux. The realm of changeable things, you don't get that kind of stability. You can introduce an ontology which explains, a kind of qualified stability in our world, but he doesn't see how it could be in this world. And the other thing is, yes, essences are only for natural kinds or things like that. Not everything has an essence. They're not essences for accidental properties. So like whiteness is not, there's no form for Aristotle there's no essence for Aristotle associated with whiteness, as far as I can tell. And I think Plato was ambivalent about that. So we saw in the Parmenides, Parmenides himself, would it be Pythagoras, brings up all of these objections a lot of the objections that Aristotle brings up. So he brings up the third man argument. He brings up, are you going to say mud is, there's a form of mud, mm-hmm. stuff like that, which is really important, in the context of our reading of Aristotle, because Aristotle is interested in, when we predicate something of a particular object, how do we say something is an object? We always make this assumption there's a thing. For for every X, there exists an X. How do you make an existence claim? And because to do that, you have to carve out some specific aspect of reality that you say is a unity and is legitimately distinct from the others. I brought up this example in the podcast. If you're looking at a cat sitting on a chair, you have to be willing to say, okay, that cat is a thing, but the cat chair is two things. It's not one thing. And we do this all the time. We have to be able to make this claim that we're carving out mind independent unities out of the world. And Aristotle only thinks we can do that with essences, and we can't get anywhere until we do that. Anyway, sorry.
So don't we use, though, isn't the whole point of introducing forms to explain our ability to form universals at all? So by recognizing, how do I know that this is a rabbit, but this is not a rabbit, but this is a rabbit, is because somehow I'm recalling the form of rabbithood, and that enables me to pick out only and all of the rabbits. That doesn't explain any of the metaphysical stuff, the stuff that I think Aristotle is most concerned about, and that sounds most modern. That is, so there's something like rabbit DNA that determines the telos of the rabbit, how a rabbit is supposed to grow into a healthy adult rabbit, whereas clearly a stick, just chopped off of its, a dead stick, or a stone is a better example. Even though it has some tendencies, it will drop it when it, gravity, but it doesn't have a telos. So therefore we don't want to say there is a form of the rock or mud. Aristotle's not going to say that. But for Plato, I would think just being able to pick out, is this a stone? Is this not a stone? Is this white? Is this not white? That we really do need a form for every universal.
Yeah, it seems like even though he seems ambivalent about it in the Parmenides and other places, it seems like that is Plato's theory, that for any property we can attribute to something, for any universal, we're gonna say there's a form. And part of the reason motivating that type of explanation is actually very similar to what for human causality and the stuff that our early modern philosophers were going through, which is that they don't understand how formality in general gets into the mind from the outside. There's no particular sensory modality for taking in form, right? Just like there's no modality for taking in causality, we don't seem to have a particular sensory faculty that will take in the sameness of two different objects. But even worse than that, those objects aren't exactly the same. The particular sensible objects we have in the world, they're changing. They're not exactly alike. So what is it we're doing when we put them into the same category? In other words, contemporary philosophers would say, what is the truth maker? I want a real entity in the world that tells me that something is a rabbit, because I want to be able to say that there's something that makes that sentence true. Because
and we ran into, in talking about Kripke and people like that, the issue of it might be ambiguous on first look that they're sort of phenomenal rabbits, things that play the functional role of rabbits, that look like rabbits, but we might find that this type of thing that we thought was a rabbit actually is a kind of marsupial that just looks like a rabbit, or maybe it's a robot rabbit. It's not a real rabbit. And so, we need some scientific investigation. It's not just a matter of how we pick out rabbits, because we could be picking them out wrongly on closer inspection. Unless we want to just say, well, there's two concepts here. There's phenomenal rabbit, which includes very accurate robot rabbits and these marsupials that look like rabbits. And then there's the biological rabbit, which is something that we have discovered as a subgenre of a subgenus of this phenomenal rabbit type.
Yeah, this is so when we did Locke and we saw that he wanted to talk about real essences, right, in terms of quote unquote microstructure, or he has a different word for it, but that's how it's often talked about. So that's the way we want to talk about essences in the modern world. We want to talk about the essence of water as H2O, or the essence of rabbit as having something to do with DNA, maybe, but it's a bit more complicated with species, evolution. We have to give an account of the biology of the rabbit and ultimately its structure, its internal structure. So Locke did not like secondary substance. He didn't like this kind of brute solution of saying, okay, this belongs to a natural kind and that corresponds to a form. I think Aristotle is on the track of internal dynamic structure as the and dynamic is important, because it turns out that the stability of things is explained by motion, repetition, and that becoming is not just the enemy of being.
Sure. Yeah. So there really are, for Aristotle, forms in things, but we would have to investigate them. We don't have any intuitive grasp of them. That's the whole thing for Plato, is that the senses can deceive us to actually figure out anything. To make, we have to turn to the mind. And so you were saying, there's no specific organ that we have for grasping forms. Well, it's just the mind. The mind is the kind of object
Plato,
that is optimized to grasp form.
For Plato, it was intellectual intuition or recollection. For Descartes, right? Descartes had his own version of that. What underlies the changing wax? It's the substance. That's the thing that stays the same. And we have a common sense for experiencing that substance that's different from our normal sensory modalities. So Aristotle's aware of Meno's problem. He brings it up early on in the Metaphysics, and he understands that we have to have some kind of familiarity with rabbits even before we fully investigate and find out what the explanation of rabbit is, which will be some definition for him, describing its genus, its species and different genus and differentiate its species. So yeah, it's it's the essence is ultimately an object of investigation, but we start out with some rough pre-theoretical familiarities. The same thing with water, right? We start out with pre-theoretical familiarity of its properties. We see that there's some regularity to the properties. It's not entirely rote or something, right? Water looks different when it's frozen than when it's not frozen. But there's a systematicity to those properties. And for someone like Kripke, those properties are how we fix something. They are not the essence itself. You couldn't give the essence of water by listing off the properties of our macro level involved in our macro level experience of water. Those things are clues, and they are clues to the fact that there is some essence underneath that. And we don't know what that is. And, and humanity didn't know what that essence was for the bulk of its existence. And maybe we still don't, but finally we can discover it as H2O.
Right. Fix in terms of actually attaching the concept to the thing, not fix as in repair or something, in case that was
right. Sorry. Yeah. It allows us to, yeah. So we see the stripes, Kripke called them stereotypes. We see stripes on a tiger. It's a stereotype that allows us to say, okay, that particular thing is a kind of thing. And even when we turn out to be wrong, we find tigers that don't have stripes on them. It doesn't matter. That's not the point. The stripes aren't the essence. The essence is something else. The stripes are a clue to the fact that there is an essence. This is a structured entity of a certain kind, and tiger. Yeah. Anyway. All right. So that's the rough background of all this.
Well, let me ask one more background question, because this just came up when I was discussing Plato's forms with folks. Is we think we know forms for Plato through intellectual intuition, which seems like a very solitary act, but yet we've got in Plato the idea of dialectic is the only way that we ascend the ladder and are able to focus our attention on the forms. So it is not a solitary, it's not a mystical act. Is there any problem with that? The fact that it seems like it has to be public, in that we have to engage with another person in dialectic in order to discover the forms, but yet I guess actually apperceiving the form is maybe a better word, has to happen on an individual intuitive level.
Yeah, I don't
by another person's talking, or maybe you could do dialectic by yourself. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's ordinary use of the forms, right, which is just part of everyday experience. I think Plato, if he thought that there's a form of a rabbit, we couldn't experience particular rabbits without the apparatus of the forms being available to us and the act of anamnesis, recollection. But then there's philosophical, there's doing metaphysics, there's doing philosophy, there's contemplation, climbing the ladder. I associate climbing the ladder with getting a philosophical handle on the forms. And things like virtue, something else Aristotle says about Socrates in particular in here, is he's really concerned more about ethics. He's not as concerned as much about the deeper metaphysics of this, especially not for the perceptible world. But ethics presents a big problem, right? Because unlike rabbits, it's harder. There's more disagreement over what virtue is, for instance, in a rabbit. And I think that type of the thing does require some ladder climbing and maybe contemplating the good or whatever it is that is supposed to happen. But.
Right. It could be that if we just don't know how to take care of rabbits, we live in a society with way too much pollution and not enough green plants, that all of the rabbits are pretty scraggly. But somehow, given that, maybe we could analyze rabbithood, pull one into a lab, breed them on our own, and we could determine, oh, this is actually what rabbits are shooting for. Those mangy things, if we were just to generalize from our experience, we would never actually know what a true rabbit is. We would know some things about it, but we wouldn't know what the majestic creature that a rabbit could be, its full potential. I think that's the same with virtue, is that we have people that are mostly kind of driven by their desires and do not fulfill Plato's requirement of virtue, but we have enough raw material to work with that we can then analyze it, and we can do the philosophy to determine, that's what ideal virtue is. Maybe we never see it in any individual. It's a purely normative enterprise, but we can make that. So there is, I think, available to other objects, something like that. But you'd have to construct a
Yeah,
weird
there's something
situation.
normative about the forms. There's
Yep.
the ideal rabbit, and things can fall short. And the rabbit whose leg has been cut off is still a rabbit, and the rabbit who doesn't look much like a rabbit because he's sick, is still a rabbit, or maybe even the rabbit who's genetic because of genetic mutation or something looks different than we expect. Is also a rabbit. So there's trueness to type and less trueness to type, but it's important that there be a normative component because we see a lot of variation in individuals in the world, and we can't really explain how we can lump them all into the same category without the normative component. We have to be thinking in terms of norms that they are meeting to some degree or to a lesser degree, but they're not meeting them ever perfectly. So,
all right, let me start on
all
the
right.
third
So let me
sentence.
just continue.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just. I guess we'll do. I think the paragraphs. Well, Sachs makes the paragraphs longer, but anyway, we'll see. I'll just continue on. For the forms are just about equal to, are not fewer than, those things in search of the causes of which they went on from the latter to the former. This is where Sachs becomes difficult. Forms are just about equal to, or not fewer than, those things in search of the causes of which. Okay, so it's the perceptible things that we're searching for the causes of which they went on from the latter to the former.
The latter being the things we're wanting to find causes for, the former being the forms, the causes.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Let's keep going. For over against each particular thing, there is something with the same name, and also for the other things besides the beings, to which there belongs a one over many, both among the things around us and among the everlasting things. So what he's saying there is that there's a one, for some property of perceptible objects, there's a one over many form, but also for forms. Forms have things in common. Forms can be categorized into higher universals. There's a one over many for them as well. And there's going to turn out to be one over many that combines the set of all rabbits with the rabbit form, and that will give you a rabbit prime form, and so on. And then you have to do it again. There's a rabbit prime form, which takes the set of all the rabbits plus the rabbit form, and then, anyway, you get it. You get the idea.
Well, and this is, so Sachs provides in his footnote here, he says that the manuscripts are hard to make sense of for this sentence. The point is, while the forms answering to the species of things around us are fewer than the things are, so that's what the number of forms multiplies when they're posited for every class characteristic, such as red things, scalene triangles, etc. Aristotle agrees there are forms in the first sense, but not in the second. So there's not going to be a form of mud. There's not going to be a form of cat chair, etc.
Yeah. What's more, of those ways by which we show that there are forms, it is not evident by any of them. Let's look at the footnote. There is a widespread myth according to which Aristotle's teachings are opposite to Plato's. As a result, passages such as this, in which he speaks to the disciples of Plato as we, have been dismissed as relics of Aristotle's student days. So Aristotle often says we when he's talking about the Platonists. Mm-hmm. He will often include himself as among them, and for good reason, because there are elements of Plato's theory which he's holding on to. But anyway, so included in his mature writings by some inept editor. This leads to a kind of interpretation as butchery that hacks apart the text to preserve a point of view that had no sound evidence to begin with. See the introduction. Aristotle is among those who posit forms as causes and as beings, and for that reason he is at pains to criticize in detail the technical working out of that doctrine. I think that minimizes a little bit how harsh Aristotle actually is, and we will see later on in the book. He's pretty harsh, but yeah.
Which does not actually explain the difficult syntax of the sentence you just read. What's more,
no.
Of those ways by which we show that there are forms, it is not evident by any of them. So in other words, there are various proofs that people have brought forth to say, hey, there have to be forms like the one I just gave. I recognize triangularity here, triangularity there. There must be a form of triangularity that I'm working with in my mind, but that doesn't actually demonstrate certainly that there are forms of the sort Plato was talking about that have to be outside of any existing triangle and outside of any human creation, etc.
So the arguments for the forms aren't really fully convincing, and I agree with that. For from some of them, no necessary conclusion results, while from others, there turn out to be forms of those things which we believe do not have them, like mud.
Yep.
For a result of the arguments from the kinds of knowledge, there will be forms of all those things of which there is knowledge. And as a result of the one over many, there will be even forms of negations, right? So the not rabbit has a form. Well, as a result of the thinking of something that has been destroyed, there will be forms of things that have passed away, since there is an image of these things. So it sounds like we need, dead rabbit as a form, maybe, or
illusory rabbit, the shadow that looked like a rabbit but is not in fact a rabbit. There's a form of that.
Yeah. So for everything that we can articulate, I don't know. That seems like he's saying something like that. On top of this, some of the most precise of the arguments produce forms of relations, which we claim is not a kind in its own right, while others imply the third man, which he will not discuss until later. Forms of relations that may be left of, right of, something like that. Okay.
All right, next paragraph. And in general, the arguments about the forms abolish things which we want there to be, more than we want there to be forms. For it turns out that not the dyad, but number is primary, and that what is relative is more primary than what is in its own right, as well as all those things which people who took the opinions about the forms to their logical conclusions showed to be opposed to the original sources of things. This is really vague.
Yeah.
He's referring in the previous sentences as well. And I think he's mentioned the dyad and number in the previous section where he's talking about the Pythagoreans. So we should give a little of that background insofar as we can piece it together. Just that Plato was very influenced by the Pythagoreans, the Pythagorean that worship number. And we got a little of this in our Heraclitus episode. Of course, Heraclitus is not a Pythagorean, but shared the idea, according to Ava Brand's interpretation, who we talked to, that the essence of his metaphysics was the idea of ratio, right? Logos, one of the interpretations of that word is ratio. So the fact that when we do science, we find laws like force equals mass times acceleration, that like these natural things have these mathematical relations between them, and that is the essence, I think, of what Plato or Aristotle's pointing at as the Pythagorean take. Of course, we don't really have any texts by the Pythagoreans laying out a philosophy of this sort, but that when we discover, look at the relation of the tones in music, the wavelengths, that you double them, and that, or you have mathematical relations that make beautiful harmony. So this just shows that numbers and the ratios between them are at the very, very heart of the universe. And so that's supposed to be established, that there could be something that is we can't see, that we can only grasp with our minds, that yet could somehow be the basis metaphysically for things in the world. And we don't know exactly how the formula force equals mass times acceleration makes things follow that pattern. I mean, as moderns, we more think like, no, there's no formula out there floating. That's just a model we create with our minds. But there are relations in things themselves. So this is part of what Aristotle's issue is going to be: is, are these relations in the actual perceptible things, or do they have to be in some heavenly world that even if there were no things, then they would behave according to these mathematical ratios?
Yeah, the ratios are promising, right? Because we're trying to explain what stays the same in this world of becoming in flux, and what is it that can produce persistent objects when they're constantly changing. And you can see with a rectangle, if you take a rectangle that has a certain ratio of one side to another, and you make it shrink or you make it expand, the ratio would stay the same. And so, yes, it's the Pythagorean account seems to be onto what will become the account in modern science, which is that we can give these mathematical explanations and we can say that, hey, those are the static entities, right? For the Pythagoreans, they can say, hey, look, the ratios are the static entities that aren't in the world of becoming that explain the stability of the world of becoming. Here, what is he saying? I mean, he's going to say, so why did the forms abolish things which we want there to be more than we want there to be forms? I think he's going to say they're going to do away with what he calls the primary substances in a sense so they make the relative prior to the intrinsic essentially. Or in other words, we want ultimately we want to say there are these entities out there in the real world, these real particular perceptual objects which have their essences in them because they are not they are what they are, mind independently and not relative to our way of looking at them, our way of conceiving of them. They really are. That rabbit really is what it is in its own right, in itself. And I think what Aristotle's saying here is he doesn't like this appeal to say, oh, I got to make this relative to something outside of it in order to explain what it is. Then it isn't really what it is in its own right. It's just this kind of, think of Plato's line. It's just this kind of, it's quasi-real. It's not even fully real. It's like being a phenomenalist. You just have this phenomenal world and then the things in themselves outside of it. So the dyad, I think, when he talks about the dyad, that so it turns out that not the dyad, but number is primary. The dyad is like the matter. So some weird theory where the world of becoming, the perceptible world, is produced by the way the numbers work on the matter of the dyad, or the way, and that, or actually maybe the forms come from that first. Anyway, it's a weird theory. I don't understand it, but
well, I was just looking up the word dyad that occurs starting in, I think, just the chapter or so previous.
It's greater 6. Or smaller is the dyad that he's talking about in particular. The lesser and the greater, or something like that.
Right. Just to read a random part of chapter 6 that has dyad in it. Plato made distinctions about the things that are sought. It is clear from what he has been said that he used only 2 causes: the one that is responsible for the what it is, so forms, and the one that results from material. It is clear that the underlying material is said to be over and against which the forms are in the case of perceptible things, and the one among the forms is that it is the dyad of the great and the small.
So the forms are produced by, the matter, right? So he's drawing an analogy, and for particular perceptible things, there's matter and form that make the rabbit a rabbit. And then he's going to say the forms themselves can be broken down into that structure according to Plato, where the matter of the forms is the dyad and the form of the forms is number. So we simply don't get, as far as I know, it's not anywhere in Plato or anywhere else. We don't get an account of that except here through Aristotle. So, and I don't know that anyone understands it. Yeah.
I mean, can we imagine what the great and the small would have to do with what we know about forms and Plato's conversation about forms in general? The idea of, in the Parmenides questions came up, I think heat she gave as a really good examples, that heat seems to be a kind of thing that you could imagine the hot itself actually causing heat in things. Like that's the way heat transfers, as if there was, an actual, so that there was a question, is the form of heat the thing that allows us to pick out all the hot things and that physically causes all the hot things to be hot? Is the form itself hot? And in the case of heat, it at least sort of seemed that would be reasonable. Whereas is the form of well, is the form of color, if we're going to say there's a form for color in general, not just red, is that itself colored? Well, if it is actually the form of all the colors, like, well, which color would it be? So it doesn't seem like it would have to be multicolored. It would have to be, so maybe we want to say, no, forms are actually more abstract. They are not. So the form of heat is in fact not hot. The form of color is in fact not colored. I'm trying to think, just walking through this logic, can we relate this to the great and the small? that obviously there's something about the form that could infect all these things, that there's a greatness about it, but the small is what enables us to actually, it has to get into those individual hot things, those individual colors. So it has to be something, it's sort of infinite and vast. It could reach all possible things, but it also has to be small in that it can connect to individual things. I'm completely speculating here, but is that all reasonable?
I'm not sure, because I think the dyad, again, the dyad is not the matter of perceptible things. The dyad is the matter of the forms.
Right. So I'm saying this is what enables the form to inject itself in the individuals. There could be a very, very small hot thing. So somehow the form, what is its relation? This is, of course, what is participation? So if you thought that, because that's kind of what in general with things, like you've got the form of rabbithood, which we can only grasp intellectually, but then once it gets with the matter, well, then the rabbit can fuck other rabbits, for instance. It can frolic in the meadow. The form can't do that. So there has to be something material, or I'm thinking of this just by a metaphor, small about the rabbit. The material is sort of the nitty gritty, the fine details that allows this to actually exist as a material object in the world, whereas the form is literally this infinite, vast, godlike thing that somehow connects with it. So I would think any form, you could say it has its infinite aspect, and it has its aspect that enables it to touch matter, the big and the small. This is my theory.
All right. Yeah, I don't know. But I think, so that's, we can speculate about that. But for the, purposes of what we're looking at right now, you were talking about is red. And it sounds like an absurd thing to say, but I think Plato does think that, because any entity needs an essence. If we are explaining a rabbit in terms of the essence of rabbit, and that turns out to be a Platonic form, then we have to ask, well, how is the Platonic form what it is? And that's why Aristotle says there's a third man argument. He wants another form for that. But Plato apparently was willing to say that it's the form of itself, that it is essentially what it is, which is just what Aristotle wants to say about particular sensible objects, that, like rabbits, that they have that quality. You don't have to go to the world of the forms to get something that is its own essence in a way, or it has its own essence in it. But anyway, so when he's saying something here like what is relative is more primary than what is in its own right, what he's saying is, I think particular individuals are better candidates for mind independent entities, for things that are in their own right, than forms, which are in a way relative. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're just making me want to do some sort of Bertrand Russell set theory. So the form is a set of all objects that are hot, but includes itself as a member of its own set. And is there something absurd about that? I guess is the question. Can the form of hotness actually be hot as explained by its relation to itself, the form of hotness?
Yeah. I mean, it can't just be an extension, right? It has to be an intention, but I get that's a way of thinking about this. Yeah.
All right. Continuing the paragraph. What's more, by the assumption by which we say there are forms, there will be forms not only of beings, but also of many other things. The object of the intellect is one thing not only as concerns beings, but also as applied to other things. So properties, for instance, accidents.
Mm-hmm.
And there is demonstrative knowledge not only about thinghood, but also about other sorts of beings.
So thinghood being substance. Let's just make sure that
Yeah.
readers know the typical translation. Yeah.
And vast numbers of other such conclusions follow. But both necessarily and as a result of the opinions about them, if the forms are shared in, so participation, if the forms are shared in, there must be forms only of independent things. For things do not share in them incidentally, but must share in each by virtue of that by which it is not attributed to an underlying subject.
Okay, so let's stop there. So so that by which it is not attributed to an underlying subject. So remember, substance, this word that is being translated as thinghood. Aristotle thinks that that's the thing that can have other things predicated of it, but can't be predicated of other things. And substance, right, is going to turn out to be essence. And in particular, there's only going to be essences of these real unities, like rabbits, like these particular primary substances.
Yep.
So that's what he means by independent things. There must be forms only of independent things, like, say, a rabbit, which has a substance, has an essence. And mud is not the same sort of thing. There's not a form of mud. It doesn't have a substance. It's not a real unity in the same way. And the same thing for accidental properties like red. So,
and for things do not share in them incidentally. So, something might happen to be to the left of something else, but being to the left of that other thing is just where it happens to be right now. That's not.
And the same thing with any accidental
it's
property. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be a relation. It can just be being read. Any accidental property, any non-essential property.
Right. Which is what Joe Sax's turn. He insists that I'm calling it incidental. I don't know why he finds that. He finds accidental, the accident, which is what everybody's used. All the translators of Aristotle.
Whatever you want to say is the non-essential property. So any property, non-essential property is any property thing could, it might have it, it might not have it, but it's not going to stop being what it is if it loses it.
Mm-hmm.
So the rabbit, even if it's not red or black or white, it's going to still be a rabbit. But there are certain properties, the essential properties, that if the rabbit loses them, it's no longer a rabbit. That's the distinction. So, and Aristotle thinks it's those properties in particular that we should be talking about forms of, not of stuff like, oh, it happens to be white, it happens to be black. All right.
They do not share in them incidental, but must share in each by virtue of that which is not attributed to an underlying subject. What does the subject mean here?
So subject is hupokemenon, and it's thought of as the substrate. So Aristotle's categories theory of substance is at work here. He's kind of he's really expanding on his categories theory of substance. So the underlying subject, again, is the substrate of which can be predicated of other things. But which can have things predicated of it, can have properties, but can't be a property. That's why. So, and he's going to explore candidates, right, for this underlying subjects like matter, like physical matter. Is that the underlying subject? But anyway, we haven't gotten there yet. But so in this case, what he's saying is the particular things must share in each by virtue of that which is not attributed, by which it is not attributed to an underlying subject. So in other words, by virtue of the essence, right? So if you share in a form of red, you're sharing in it in the sense that it's a property. But if you share in a form of rabbit, you're sharing in an essence. And the essence is the thing by virtue of which it is substance. It is underlying subject as well. So all those things go together. And he wants to say, in other words, that there's only going to be forms for things that make something an individual substance, a real particular thing, a real unity out there in the world. And there's not going to be forms for things that don't do that work.
So this seems to be pointing at an interesting way that substances attach to properties, that some of them just, in fact, we don't want to call rabbithood a property of rabbits. It is just the essence of rabbits in general and this particular rabbit, but its whiteness somehow, in the categories, it was just explained that, well, you can predicate whiteness of the rabbit. You can't predicate rabbithood of the whiteness. So therefore, rabbit is the substance and whiteness is the accident, as that translation called it, the incidental property, as it might be called here. But it seems like it's saying that if something is not an essential property of it, it still participates in whiteness somehow, right? The rabbit is participating in whiteness because it is white, but yet it is not whiteness. It participates in it by virtue of something that is attributed to an underlying subject. So there must be some base level that has the rabbit and its rabbithood and also has the whiteness that sort of connects them. Is that what we're getting at here?
Yeah. So you have, okay. So I see what you're getting at. Yeah. So we want to, we might think of in terms of just this kind of Cartesian substance. Well, actually that'll turn out to be matter. All right. But for Descartes, it's just extension. But yeah, and for us, we might think of it as primary properties of whatever science says it is underneath. But yeah, I think the idea is that if if I have a particular object, a particular rabbit, and I want to say this thing is white, what am I predicating whiteness of? Am I predicating whiteness of all the atoms? No. Am I predicating whiteness of, any other material constituents or parts? No. I'm predicating it of a whole thing that is a real unity. And the reason it's there's an explanation for it being a real unified particular object. And that explanation is its essence, but we could describe that in terms of the internal workings of the rabbit or whatever. So, so in other words, the whiteness it's obviously being predicated of the particular. It's not being predicated of the form of rabbit in general, but the thing that allows us to say that this is a particular is the essence insofar as it's, in the end, it is going to be a hylomorphic compound, which is going to be said the essence of things is the form imprinted on the matter. But again, that's something we get to later in the metaphysics. But yes, but the important thing is for Aristotle, if I want to say something has a form, it's got to be something that makes it a particular. It's got to be it's got to do the work of individuating it into a real particular unity. And red doesn't do that, right? There's a bunch of things in the world that are red that aren't, redness doesn't combine things, doesn't make anything a one in the way that rabbit makes something a one. Do you get what I'm saying?
I mean, what about the band Simply Red?
It's a good band. It makes it simple. Redness can make it something simple, but it can't make it.
I didn't know that this was a very sophisticated Aristotelian a metaphysical claim in the name of this band, right. But I'll have to.
They had thought a lot about the metaphysics before they came up with that name. But
all right, well, let me read that. So we've just been parsing this last sentence. Things do not share in them incidentally, but must share in each by virtue of that which is not attributed to an underlying subject. And then there's a parenthetical supposed to explain. I mean, for example, if something partakes of the double, then this also partakes of the everlasting, but incidentally, since it is incidental to the double to be everlasting. which is interesting because I thought the double as a mathematical thing, I mean, one of its essential properties is that it is non-corporeal, not part of the changing material world, and
That's
thus
what he means by
everlasting.
everlasting. Yeah.
So why is it only incidental to the double to be everlasting? I mean, I know it's not. If we want to say what is the essence of the double, well, it's to be, times two. Like if you're going to give the definition of the double, it does not include, it's an everlasting form. I mean, the fact that it is a form at all is not part of its definition, but it's still an essential property of it, right?
I don't know. Yeah. It is incidental to the double to be everlasting. Well, in our particular, right, when we deal with doubleness in the everyday world, it doesn't have anything to do with everlastingness, right? Maybe it has something to do with the form of the double. This is his critique. I don't know.
No,
It's
a
weird example to give.
Yeah. Because we do. This might be a general, of course, this would have to be a general statement about numbers, that there are the eternal numbers that the Pythagoreans were concerned with. But then for numbers and I guess every other property, there have to be numbers that are in fact changing and degrading in things because they attach to things. So that if you actually have 3 rabbits, well, those, I don't know. I mean, do we want to say those rabbits as they die off and then 3 becomes 2 or whatever, that somehow we don't say the number has changed, right? Plato specifically says, this is his argument for why the soul is immortal, is because it's essential to the soul to be life itself. And so if something dies, it's not that the soul as it exists in the individual, like as its form, that there's a sort of mortal version of the form. There might be an eternal soul, but then there's the mortal soul that you have, and that crusts and dies when you die. Like, this is exactly the point of Plato's argument, is that things in the formal realm do not admit of their opposites. So the double, even if it is instantiated in infallible, dying, mortal individuals, will not itself be affected by their fallibility.
But yeah, Aristotle seems to want to say that, if there's a particular thing in the world that we can call double, it also partakes of the everlasting because the form is everlasting, which seems like an odd thing to say. Anyway, why don't you read
Therefore,
on?
the forms will be the thinghood of things.
Okay.
And the
forms will be the substance of things. Go ahead.
And the same things will signify thinghood there as here. What are the there? What are the there and here? in mortal things versus
the substance is forms will be the substance of particular sensible objects. And the same things I think will signify thinghood there in the realm of the forms as here. So in other words, it's the same sorts of, there will be when we explain the essence of the forms and the essence of particular sensible objects, we're going to be using the same entities, which is forms. I think that's what he's saying.
I mean, why even use the word signify here? Like, why would things signify thinghood? Words signify things, and we could use words that signify thinghoods. Is it just because the things participate in thinghood, or they instantiate thinghood, that thereby epistemologically they signify thinghood, that the rabbit signifies to us rabbithood? I'm not sure why this point is being made in this sentence.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe account for explain would be better. The same things will explain substance there as here. The forms will be the substance. Forms will be the substance of things, and the same things will signify substance. Yeah, it's unfortunate because I think in the first instance of things, he's talking about perceptual objects. In the second instance of things, he's talking about forms, but I don't know.
Otherwise, what would the something be that is said to be apart from the things around us, the one over many? So I think he was trying to say, from the Platonic point of view, doubleness has to be the same in physical doubles as in the ideal double. Otherwise, how would the form actually apply to both of them? Right? It's not that there's a separate form in individuals.
Right. Otherwise, what would be the something be that is said to be apart from things around us?
The Platonic form.
Yeah. We'll keep reading. Let's
and
read
if
to the
the
end and then
forms,
let's figure it out.
Yeah. And if the forms and the things that participate in them have the same form, there would be something in common. So this is the idea of, even the hotness itself, the form of hotness, the form of heat has a characteristic of hotness because it's related to itself.
Heat is hot.
Right. And then this is parenthetical. Are there parentheses in ancient Greek? It seems probably not.
No, I don't think so. But
if the forms and things that participate in them have the same form, there would be something in common. For y is 2, one and the same is applied both to destructible pairs and to those that are many but everlasting, more so than is applied both to itself and to something. So that's a good question that you could say, I'm going to consider two forms. I'm going to consider the form of triangularity and the form of circularity. Well, I've now counted forms. So there are eternal doubles, just like I can count the two rabbits. And we say, if you're a Platonist, that it's because the form of doubleness, of the form of 2, applies both to the material things and to the everlasting things. So why not then make it apply to the form itself, right? Unless there is some sort of Russellian set theory problem that a set can't be a member of its own, of itself.
Yeah. So this is the third man. This is the third man objection. So we get the forms, we get the broad argument is that the forms are explaining these two different realms, the realms of physical things, the realm of physical things, and then the realm of the entities of the forms itself. It's kind of a weird thing going on now. The essences are doing this double work in one world of becoming and one world of being.
All right, last sentence of this paragraph, and I think of our session today. But if the form is not the same, there would be ambiguity. And it would be just as if someone were to call both Callias and a block of wood human being while observing nothing at all common to them.
So in other words, if the form is not the same means, suppose we said that, okay, we don't like this idea of, what was your example? We don't like the idea of
the form applying to itself. So you'd want form prime. You'd say, no. The form of doubleness is not itself double, but it has a different form that enables it to be what it is, that provides its thinghood insofar as it has thinghood.
Yeah.
I guess even these unseeable things have thinghood, right? They are still substances according to this.
They are the only substances. For Plato, they're the only substances. Yeah. And it's like Plato makes the properties the substances. Aristotle wants the particulars to be the substances. If you wanted to sum up the ontology very quickly, that's the way you would do it. There are reasons, there are good reasons to want to say the properties are the only substances, because it seems like everything underneath is just matter. And and it's changing. And if we really want to and it's matter all the way down and it's flux all the way down. If you want to explain stability, we have to explain it in terms of properties. And we can see, it's kind of inviting because, properties individuate and properties explain how different objects are the same. And, one particular rabbit comes into being and then passes away, but others follow, and they're the same in some sense. So you find, if you're looking for stability and unity and all the rest of it, you seem to find it in the realm of the property, or clusters of properties. But Aristotle's going to say, no, that doesn't. It maybe, but it's not the properties themselves that you can call the substances. The substance will turn out to be the thing to which those properties apply, and the substance is what it is by virtue of an essence, which is in the thing, and blah blah blah.
Well, so this last sentence is making me finally the third man argument click for me that I didn't completely remember. Right, we've been saying there's the individuals, there's the form of the individuals. Well, what connects the individuals to the form of the individuals? Is it that there is a form that covers both of them? And so that's the idea, is if you use the solution, right? Plato's solution seems to be, no, the form just covers itself. So it is in its own self. But there's something that seems self-contradictory about that. How can a set be a member of itself? So maybe you want to say there's form prime. But then what actually makes form prime and form, the form of doubleness and then the form of doubleness, what actually makes them both about doubleness? Well, there must be a third man that covers both the original form and form prime. So we'll call it form prime prime. The thing that I was confused about before was that form prime prime, is it a way just of talking about form prime? No, it's a way of connecting form prime to the original form.
Yeah.
To the individuals ultimately.
Right. So for form, so we have all the individual red objects in the world. Then we have the form red. And we know, right, the essence is supposed to be an explanation. Why are all these particular things red? Well, they have the form of red. They participate in the form of red. And then you say, well, why is the form of red? How do you say what it is? And Plato will want to say, well, it's participates in itself, and it is the form of red by virtue of being the red form, which again is not a bad solution, because it's kind of what Aristotle wants to do at the level of particular. But in any case, so the essence, for Plato, the form can be its own essence, and he can put a stop to the third man. But Aristotle seems to think that doesn't work. I forget if he directly argues against it, but in any case, he's going to say you need a form prime, red prime, and what's the extension of that? Form red, and also all the red particular things. All of those objects belong to the set that is the extension of form prime. But then what is, what is form prime? Is that something entirely different from red? Anyway, you would have to, you'd have to say, well, how do those, how does red prime and red, how do those two things relate? How do they have something in common? And then you need a form to explain their commonness, right? At every step, you want to be able to say, you want to be able to explain commonality. Yeah. So anyway, I don't know.
So we got to go through 2 pages of text, but we got a lot of background. So I think this is sufficient. This is going to serve as part 3 to that Aristotle episode for the Partially Examined Life folks. So this is fine. This is all you need, hopefully, to get you a little ahead of the game as we move forward in the metaphysics. For Close Read subscribers, we're going to record another couple on this part. Right? We want to finish chapter 7, so probably at 2 more sessions. Chapter 8, right? No, this is chapter 9.
9.
We're in chapter 9.
There's a form that there's a form that connects all these. Anyway, so if you find this useful, hopefully we'll be able to get through a little more text next time, because we've already done all of our Plato review that we are going to. I'm not going to reread the Parmenides between now and 2 days from now, when we're going to record more on this, which hopefully means we will remember more of this still 2 days from now than we would if we waited our normal length. So
Thanks for participating. Good talking to you, Wes. Bye, everybody.
All right. Thank you.